Since we spoke about how it's the Bainani of Tanya that has free choice whether to follow the thought or not. He's the character with free choice. So how does the Russia get to do tshuva if he doesn't have free choice?
We didn't say that way. What we phrased is that the I think maybe we did say that, but then it's wrong. So I'll say it right now. That the classic image of what free choice means is the Beinoni of Tanya. Like what people tend to imagine as free choice, referring to a pre-action moment of clarity, where there's an active choice prior to any expression of self. That everything you do, like the classic image of saying the person has free choice, is actually requiring a state of mind which enables a moment of clarity, balanced clarity, prior to any expression of self. So if that's what you mean when you say free choice, but many times that's what people have in mind, like that's their image of free choice. So that's a Beinoni of Tanya. Now, once I phrase it that way, then it's not so surprising to say that's a Beinoni of Tanya, because that's a very fascinating cue. Saying that that you never find yourself retroactively after you've done something or said something or even thought something. That's a phenomenal state of balance. It's the Beinoni.
You never find yourself what?
Again, saying that you have free choice, like a simple view, free choice is something that you decide within yourself what to think, what to say, and what to do, prior to thinking, saying, or doing it, is implying a state of mind so balanced that it surfaces enough clarity prior to any expression of self that you can execute that choice. So most of us don't have such balance as a constant in life. Okay, so that's the Beinoni. So that's not necessarily what Torah calls free choice, free will. I could say that, for instance, what we're reading now, this whole essay, this whole mamar is not assuming that. The opposite. This whole essay is assuming that you are only reacting. You're not acting at all. So the whole text we're learning now is all referring to someone who's not a Beinoni, or at least referring to those elements in life where you need rectification. It's all rectifying. That's how we translate it in English. Rectifying your ego, if you remember. So it's all a path of rectification. So that's tshuva. Even how we've discussed this a lot, even how we tend to read the beginning, which is simply referring to the good you do, even that we tend to read in retrospect, of how to reassess the good, and not how to initially be able to view the good this way, which would be the truer view, like being as opposed to doing. So if I say that your point of choice is focused on how you react, so that's a Russia. That's the definition of a Russia. Like Chazal said,
Russia get to do tshuva?
Doing tshuva is reacting correctly. It's not acting correctly. That's exactly what it is.
But what awakens tshuva in the Russia?
So that's the question. So.
The $1 million.
So either I say it's a bat kol, like Chazal say, that there's like a...
You think that Russia has choice, but it's reactive?
Yeah, that's what we're learning, how to react, how to take, when I do good, when I find myself doing good, how do I take my good? When I find myself doing bad, how do I take my bad?
So that's the answer, there's a Bosco?
What's Bosco mean?
That's how Chazal called it.
What?
A voice from the heavens, do tshuva.
Again, I could picture it much more empirically, and a much less mystical view. Like we said just now, that a total, like the classic image of action choice, it requires a Beinoni. But sometimes you do decide what to do. A person, I mean, most of us are not, like we studied it before, that saying that you're completely not a Beinoni is also not true. And also then we discussed that there are many ways how to phrase this. Like maybe there are certain areas of my life where I'm a Beinoni, certain layers of my soul that I'm a Beinoni about. We discussed this many times.
You wouldn't murder anybody.
Nachon, for instance. And if you want to murder someone, then probably you'll have a moment of clarity. So much so that if you don't have that moment of clarity, then even a court of law might say that you're innocent because you were temporarily insane. So Torah says that you're temporarily insane. Any affair you do, there's a moment of temporary insane. It's Basi Lagani. That's what we're studying now. Ruach Shtut. And tomorrow is the Maimer of
And that's my
Basi
second
Lagani.
question, which I'm bringing in spot Ruach Shtus. I'd like to have your take on what Ruach Shtus
So that's exactly what we're talking about right
What
now.
does
It's
that
very
mean,
easy.
Ruach?
A spirit of folly. It's an expression from Chazal that a Jew would never sin unless a spirit of folly took over him. A Ruach Shtus. And Frierdiker Rebbe, whose yahrzeit is tomorrow, the next day, sorry, on Wednesday. Tuesday night, yeah, tomorrow night. So he wrote a very famous discourse, Ma'amar, for the day of his passing. When in his final days, the Frierdiker Rebbe was very sick; he couldn't speak, or it was at least very, very difficult for him to speak. Like in the last few years of his life, after he left Russia and all the torments he went through there, so he wasn't healthy, and he lived for 10 years in the U.S. And in those 10 years, his health deteriorated. In his final years, he wasn't so able to speak, or at least not to give long discourses, so he'd write his Maimarim and give them out. And he had prepared 3 discourses, and he dated them for 3 dates.
4 days.
4.
Yes. Yud Shvat, Yud Gimel Shvat, Purim, and Beis Nissen.
Okay, so
It
4.
says so in Basi Lagani after Shvat.
Because I forgot that. So 4 dates, but it was all a hemshech. One long discourse. You could, like in Chabad, there are many discourses that way. That each one is another layer on top of one longer discourse called a hemshech, like a continuum of discourses. And he had written them out and dated them. And the first one ended up being his passing date. He passed away on Yud Shvat, which was
Which was his Bobby Rifkus.
yeah, officially he dated it to his grandmother's passing date. But then he also, Bashgacha Pratit, he also passed away. You know, the Rebbe's entire, our Rebbe's entire Nesius, like his whole 40-some years of leading Lubavitch, he based very, very explicitly on this continuum of a discourse. There are 20 chapters in this discourse. Every year the Rebbe would give a discourse of his own on one of the chapters of this discourse. For 20 years he did that, and then he did it again. So you have 2 discourses, like 40 years, not 40 because he only went on till the last 2 he didn't do it twice. So you have 38 discourses from the Rebbe on this one discourse.
And some years he did more than one, so it's more than.
Some years he spoke about it twice. There's also Hanachas, like different quotations, v'chulei. So, but officially he taught a letter each year. So there's even a custom today in Chabad that every year we study like now is the Yorzeit's coming up, so the chapter corresponding to this year's chapter 9. So there are 2 discourses from the Rebbe for chapter 9. Like the discourse he said 9 years after the passing and 29 years after the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So that's Tafshin Yud Tet and Tafshin Lamed Tet. So in this discourse, it's a very, very fundamental discourse. I'm sure that anyone who studied anything in Chabad for the past 40 years, whether he knows it or not, is familiar with a lot of the concepts discussed in this discourse, because they're like the foundation stones of all of the Rebbe's Hashkafa. So one of the first points discussed there is how is this quotation from Chazal that a Jew never sins unless he is taken over by a spirit of folly, ruach shtus. And the Frierdiker Rebbe goes on to explain this in great length, where the uftu, the vort that he says is that being the case, and the rectification of one's bad requires like pivoting to the other extreme and acquiring or executing a holy folly. Like just like there's an unholy spirit of folly, and in order to rectify that, you have to. It's not enough to just straighten things out and do sound, measured Yiddishkeit. It has to be also a extreme, ridiculously extreme Yiddishkeit in order to rectify the ridicule in the base of klipa, of the impure. So the term he says is shtut de kedusha, holy folly. That's one of the words in this discourse, a very important word. So in Chabad, that term today is very, very famous and important. Shtut de kedusha, to do things that are shtut de kedusha.
Like what?
Anything you do in Yiddishkeit, to do it in a way. What's his word of the spirit of folly? That there is like say generally, and then we'll say more detail. In general, it's saying that a person, there's a lot of superconscious or unconscious axiomatic assumptions leading your life and enabling you to do a lot of bad things. That the world assumes all kinds of assumptions that are not really organized cognitively. They're not really. It's not issues that you really studied in length and reached clear, sound conclusions. They're just assumed assumptions. What does the world assume? And in America, of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the world assumed that you can't have a beard and be a cultured human being. Can't be. Why? Because cultured human beings don't have beards. You can't work 5 days a week. You have to work 6 days a week. And the day you don't work has to be Sunday. Why? Kacha. The surrounding atmosphere is such that it seeps into your mother's milk, and you were born and grown on this. And it's an axiomatic truth that you assume. And you lead your life in light of these axiomatic assumptions, which are complete folly. And there's no sense to them. It's just shtus. There's no reason. They're not reasonable. They're not reasoned out. You haven't reasoned them out. There's nothing to reason out. And also their ferocity, their strength is not reasonable. They're worshipped as ultimate truths. So much so that they're not even worshipped. They're just so simply assumed upon that they're never even discussed or debated. One leads his whole life under a multitude of various assumptions, whether they're acquired or they're instinctive, whatever, it can go on and on. And that's very bad. These assumptions constitute and they cultivate a lot of the evil of the world. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said is that that our Yiddishkeit should be that way. And everything in Yiddishkeit should be done with no cheshbon, no. Tell a story from the Rebbe's father.
Finish that sentence. Everything should be done
With no, not in a reasonable manner, in a non-reasonable manner. L'mayla mitam v'das. So I tell a story. The Rebbe's father. Again, that's the same generation of the Frierdiker Rebbe. It was even when the Frierdiker Rebbe was banished from Russia, exiled. So for the main bulk of Chabad Hasidut that stayed back in Russia. So the person who was simply the highest authority, like a Rebbe, was the Rebbe's father, Rebbe Leivik, Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. And he was also the number one enemy of the state after the Frierdiker Rebbe was exiled. So he fought with the same mentality as the Frierdiker Rebbe, that you can't compromise anything. You have to be completely unreasonable about your Yiddishkeit and unreasonably loyal to your Yiddishkeit. So there's a famous story that once in one of the gatherings of the rabbis in Russia, where of course, like all of these gatherings, so he was always leading the most stubborn, standfast, authentic Jewish stand against all the attempts of communist Russia and modern Jewry to bend him into Ben Judaism. So after the official meeting, so one of the rabbis that was there, and this rabbi was identified as being he was part of the communist regime to a certain extent, but he was considered like a reasonable person, relatively. So he approached Reb Leivik in privacy, and he told him that just between us, right? Nobody's here. So after I understand your tactic, you can't bend, but after all of that being said, and all of we're never going to change anything, okay. But after all that, the truth is that in Yiddishkeit, there is flexibility. I understand you don't want to show any flexibility, but there is such a thing as flexibility. In Be'emeski, this was a person who knew Torah. He said, I've learned Torah. There is such a thing of being flexible in Torah. So what, really? There's nothing that Torah, this is the opinion of Torah, to be a complete pillar of concrete. Torah is not like that. So the story is that Reb Leivik took that to heart. Again, he's a tzaddik, an emes tzaddik. So anybody criticizes you, so first thing you believe him. So he thought about it. He said, I need to think about what you're saying. So he came back the next day and he said, you're right. And this was his compromise. What he was willing to compromise. This is after 24 hours of thinking about it. He said that the custom is, like you can go back and tell Stalin, that the custom is that when we cut our fingernails, we burn them with 3 Q-tips, with 3 pieces of 3 sticks, 3 toothpicks, and we can burn them with 2. And he was dead serious. And later on in his life, he said that his whole life he regretted that. This is giving an example of what it means to have an existential folly, a complete ridiculous grasp of your holy Yisrael. It's completely unreasonable. Just now, someone quoted from the Rebbe that he said, I never saw this, it was probably written in somebody's memoirs, that he heard from the Rebbe that he said that when he was we were learning halacha, and in halacha there's a difference between, and this is more relevant for men, but in shul when the chazan, in the repetition of davening, so every blessing you say Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, and Amen. Every blessing the chazan makes. Now in halacha there's a difference between the importance of each one of those phrases. The Amen is more important than the Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo. So why is that relevant? So for instance, if you're holding in a portion of prayer where you're not allowed to speak, so in certain portions you'd be allowed to answer Amen, but you wouldn't be allowed to say Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo. In other places you can say both, in some places you can't say either. So it's a debate in halacha. So someone quoted to me that the Rebbe once said when he was a kid about chinuch. Someone asked him about chinuch, and he said that my chinuch, until a certain age, he said, it never occurred to me that there could be a difference between Amen and Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo. There's no difference between, I don't know, like the smallest minhag or eating pork. It's all the same. That was my chinuch. That's how I was educated. So this is Reb Leivik educating you. So obviously anybody who knows the Rebbe, so this is very typical, very obvious that this was the Rebbe's mentality. That the simple education of a Jewish child is that, wearing a small yarmulke or eating pork chops, same thing, no difference. So it's, This is what we do, this is what we don't do. That's it. And that's called shtut de kedusha. Your entire concept of kedusha is folly. It's as axiomatically assumed as, or more even, obviously, as how the klipa, how the olam, how the people under the world of bad are axiomatically assuming their assumptions. And therefore Yiddishkeit should also have the aspirations and achievements much more than those of the world. I mean, these assumptions of the world enable a lot of things to take place, not good things necessarily.
So you're picking being unflexible in Yiddishkeit as an example of Shvus Kedusha.
I think that lack of flexibility is a result of a grasping of Yiddishkeit in a non-reasonable manner. If it's not reasonable, nothing to reason out. That's where the lack of flexibility comes from. Yes, so there's nothing to discuss. It's not reasoned out, so there's nothing to discuss. There's no one to discuss it with, because it's not.
But you didn't answer how the Russia gets to do tshuva.
Right, so we'll get to it. So we're connecting two questions here. So that was very generally what this term, the spirit of folly, means. Now, if we translate this just into mundane, day-to-day life, so the word is that a person, I mean, the result of these shtuyot, where do let's say the verses that Chazal learned this from a verse. I mean, like every saying in Chazal, it's always leaning on a pasuk. So the pasuk says, "Ish ketishte ishto," that a man whose wife turns aside, which meaning that she was unloyal, not necessarily completely unloyal. This is Masechet Sotah. It means a perversion. So a man whose wife